Hey, what's up guys, so Emanon here and welcome to another video. So this is going to be a bit of a guide on how to beat Tri-Brigade Lyrilusc for this current format. Obviously this is one of the most powerful and prominent decks right now, so if you're looking to play in any upcoming tournaments, you definitely should be anticipating this deck. So if you are looking to craft your main or side deck accordingly to help beat this matchup, this will be the video for you. And additionally, if you are a beta player yourself, I think this is a good video to watch as well, since I am going to be including certain countermeasures from the beta player's perspective if you are trying to help play around these cards to a certain degree, or if you just want to look at the breadth of options available that people might be tagging in to beat your strategies. So this video is going to be broken down into a couple of sections, the first of which is going to be hand traps, followed by board breakers, and then finally floodgates. So let's get started with this video now without any further ado. So the first card we're going to be talking about here is the most high impact card, even though it's not universally applicable, and that is Dimension Shifter. Obviously, Floowandereeze comes to mind with this deck, with this card, but you could easily incorporate this into other rogue strategies, like for example, Pure Zodiac. This is functionally a turn skip if this does resolve. There's very little the bird player can do about it, apart from Call by the Grave or maybe a sided in Gamma going first if you really are threatened by this card. But generally speaking, the only real way you can kind of help navigate around this card if you are the bird player is if you just open a mass amount of birds and can make a ensemble Robin, although it's a bit harder to make the Robin have a lot of materials because you won't be having access to the Wagtail Graveyard effect or the ability to attach from Graveyard via Sapphire Swallow, so it makes this a lot more difficult. And also, Robin cannot really add back under Shifter either, so it's very vulnerable to the battle phase. So overall, Shifter cuts off tries, cuts off the Lyrilusc package, makes things a lot more awkward to navigate overall. So if you can play this card in your deck, definitely do so. It is going to be an extremely powerful high impact card against this matchup. But if you are playing another deck and you want something a bit more general or easy to use, this is going to be the card for you. Of course, it's going to be Droll and Lockbird. I think most people are already aware of this one because this deck searches like no tomorrow. This is another pretty straightforward card. You basically drop it as early as you can in most cases, and you are going to be good to go. There is a bit of counterplay from the bird player's perspective. Bird Call to Sun is the most notable one. But if you are playing in a bit of a more Tri-Brigade focused hand, you can certainly use Fractal to, for example, send Kit and then send Nerval to add another Tri name to end on at least Simorgh, which isn't horrible. So there are certain ways to kind of help navigate this card. Additionally, kind of similar to Dimension Shifter, a mass amount of birds in your hand, hard drawn without having to rely on the searchers, is a great way to mitigate that. And your Robin ends up becoming a bit more powerful because you do have access to your graveyard utility effects. So I think this card is a bit more manageable, but still it is going to curtail a lot of the ability to end on the most oppressive parts of the boards. So definitely play this card if you're able to capitalize on it and are really looking to kind of help stymie this deck in its tracks. The next one is going to be PSY-Framegear Gamma. This one is very solid as well. It definitely is not as easy as dropping it at the earliest possible opportunity, but this card definitely is high impact getting rid of the body on the field, which is very notable because that in effect takes it to where your opponent has a harder time resolving cards like Sapphire Swallow without committing to their normal summon, and that is very powerful because the normal summon is what they want to generally preserve for later, so you can combo this with other hand traps or just make it a lot more awkward for them to play. Some examples that I have for you guys listed here are Turquoise Warbler, the first Recital Starling, which is similar to another card that we'll actually get to a bit later. We could also hit the Fractal Hand effect if you are anticipating that they opened weak, although generally this is not a place that I recommend using Gamma on. But these are, again, just generally good options. If you also have multiple hand traps, you can combo this with them once the Draco Future does hit the board, because you can simply just negate the Draco Future. Even if it can't be destroyed by the Gamma, you can say, for example, Nibiru Gamma the opponent, because realistically, the only monster negate that they have prior to the end phase is going to be that Draco Future. So that's something to keep in mind with cards like Gamma and like Impermanence, which we'll cover pretty soon here as well. For countermeasures, if you are playing the bird deck yourself, really just have to extend past it. It definitely just highly depends on when your opponent is going to use against you. So it's all context related and really what depends on the cards in your hand. So I can't really give super universal advice here. It's just that you have to sort of play against this card to really understand ways in which you can kind of play past it. But that is going to be it for Gamma. Next up is going to be Ash, which is a pretty good card against this matchup. It's not the most high impact, of course, but it does hit some of the greatest starters in the deck, which are Bird Call, as well as the more popular Small World and Prosperity, which have risen up quite a lot in this deck. So if you think your opponent is opened pretty weak and are relying on Small World especially, but also Prosperity to help start their plays, that could be a pretty decent Ash target. I think the only other notable one to hit is potentially Nerval or Fractal. Nerval on the search effect can be pretty good if they're not really playing around it, because it does cut off the tri-axis, so you can catch them off guard there, but generally speaking, I think that there are potentially better places to use it. I do think that if they don't start with Bird Call, it is potentially worth using it on the Nerval if they do go to search and they haven't searched another Tri-Brigade name, or hopefully they'll have another one in their hand at that point. But yeah, that is definitely something to potentially consider. And then Fractal's hand effect, kind of similar to Gamma. It kind of depends on context. It's not the most ideal target to hit, but it can certainly be useful. Like, for example, if they begin... I guess if they begin with Bird Call, you would be ashing that, so that's not a very relevant example. But Warbler plus Fractal does also become vulnerable to Ash, so that is something to definitely bear in mind if you do think that that is the only way of accessing, the +1 Lyriluscs to plus off of the Turquoise Warbler to begin with. As far as countermeasures are concerned, it kind of is similar to the Gamma thing, where if you have surplus extenders, you definitely will be in a good position. And this applies to a lot of the sort of one-for-one trades. In terms of the hand traps, you really do just have to navigate the specific game state and when they choose to interrupt you. That being said, however, if you have more bird names, you definitely are able to search a second Nerval if you think that they're trying to ash the Nerval Engrave to cut you off of accessing kit, which has happened to me actually a couple of times. So that is something to kind of think about. That way, instead of normal summoning kit, you can just normal summon the extra Nerval. So either that way, it makes their Ash a lot weaker, or it kind of just deters them for using the Ash on the Nerval altogether, because at that point, it's really just not going to be stopping you from actually ending on most of your end board, apart from ending on Oath. So that is something to definitely consider as well. Next up is going to be the effect negations. That's going to be Valor/Imperm. These cards are, of course, quite decent as well. Turquoise Warbler is one of the best cards to actually stop, because it forces them to really commit to their normal summon in a lot of cases. So that's pretty solid. The only exceptions are potentially hands that contain like Sapphire Swallow, or if they, for example, have like Fractal plus Barrel Canary in addition to the Turquoise Warbler to start with. But in that case, they had to open up all those really, really powerful enablers. So their hand was probably playing through hand traps in that case anyways. But in all of the standard 2-card plays, hitting the Warbler is generally a safe bet. You do have to, of course, use this card fairly early unless you are comboing it with other hand traps, again, like Nibiru, for example. Kit is a pretty interesting point of discussion that I've seen people talk about in terms of hitting it with Imperm. That way it effectively cuts off their tri-engine, so you can really just focus on ending on the Draco Future, or stopping the Draco Future plus Ensemble Robin, which is a countermeasure, of course. So if you are the opponent of the Bird Up player and are trying to kind of look for ways to play around the end board, you can try that choke point if you are looking to, or if you're able to play past the known interruptions, which is functionally what's going to be produced off of, like, say, a pure Lyrilusc deck, for example. But if you are not really able to actually push through that via your engine, I probably wouldn't recommend it. I would rather just take the chance on Turquoise Warbler at being a higher impact card, unless if you want to again deal with the interruptions in known quantity. Karis is also an interesting example. If they do lead with Fractal, for example, to go ahead and send Kit followed by Nerval to add it to hand. If they are trying to go for an Omen play, that does potentially get punished by additional extenders, but this is more indicative of a weaker hand anyways that didn't open Warbler with the Fractal, so that is still, I think, a fairly safe option. And then any other extenders, if you are the Bird Up player yourself, can definitely help you play past, for example, a negation on Warbler. If you have Nerval, for example, you can normal summon it and then proceed into your recital that way, and then doing the play that I mentioned in the combo video where you go ahead and search Barrel Canary and then Fractal off the Nerval, and then you go ahead and just do a lot of the bird plays. Functionally, we'll end up doing the same thing as like hitting the kit there anyways, where if, for example, they hit the kit and then you end on Draco Future plus Robin, you would generally end on a similar end board there if you had like Warbler plus Nerval. Additionally, you can go for like Farragut, and then you can summon off the bird that you're trying to special off of the Warbler if you're summoning from hand. So that's pretty good as well. Sapphire Swallow is another good way to kind of help mitigate just these general effect negation cards. And then Fractal is not a bad hit as well. If you, for example, open like Warbler plus a +1 Lyrilusc and Fractal, then that's like a decent way to follow up with a Tri package. So those are some pretty good ways to sort of play around the just general effect negation cards, which is why Gamma, of course, is more powerful in the fact that it gets rid of the body. But these cards are still quite popular as well, so it's definitely important to know how to kind of interact if you are playing with or against this card. Next up is Nibiru, which is, I think, actually not an insane hand trap, especially by itself, because the native route of the combos is already Nibiru proof, just given the fact that you're only really trading with Draco Future, but they still can end on effectively everything else. So this is not a hand trap that I'd recommend playing only by itself. You probably want to open this with another hand trap. But that being said, if you do have this card, you drop it on the second Rossetto Starling Summon if it's the only thing you have. But if you have other stuff, you can definitely wait till a lot later. And again, like I mentioned, the only real preventative measure that they have is going to be the Draco Future, because a lot of players are not really playing Appaloosa, or even if they are, you can't really generally a lot of the time go for Appaloosa with the Draco Future in the same turn 1. That's just not how the combo lines are usually structured, so you can capitalize on just being able to combo multiple hand traps with the Nibiru to get the most value. In terms of countermeasures, this is again just the route that you take pretty much when you do get Nibiru'd. So you're generally going to be preserving your normal summon for this point, so you can just go ahead and banish 4 to summon Omen, and then banish the Nibiru. Then go into Farid and use Omen Search to grab whatever name that you pretty much didn't open with between Wagtail and Cobalt Sparrow, and just sort of proceed from there. Draco Future again is also just kind of the assurance, so there's not a whole lot to talk about here. I think that Nibiru by itself is pretty straightforward in terms of how it lines up against the most prominent and the highest impact hands from the Birdo player. But if you are again playing other cards to supplement it, that's where it really shines. Next up is going to be DD Crow, which is pretty interesting because I'm not sure how popular this is right now. I haven't seen it a whole ton apart from, of course, just the mirror match. But if you are considering playing additional cards just as like a way to bulk up on hand traps, which I would definitely recommend as like probably the best way to go, especially going second against this deck, this is a pretty interesting card to look into. So you can definitely look or target the name that they send off the Fractal or Bird Call. A lot of the times players do want to play around Droll post side, so you can catch them off guard with DD Crow, because if Bird Call ends up sending the name instead of adding it, then you can really hit them with the DD Crow there. Now, of course, Turquoise Warbler checks in resolution, so if they have other names in their hand, they will still be able to get value off of it. So that is another trick that you can employ if you are a Birdo player. You can kind of like hope that your opponent sort of plays into or like kind of bites with their DD Crow, right? And then you can just summon out the name from your hand if you have a surplus one, which is pretty good. And then Fractal just natively plays into the DD Crow as is, which is pretty solid as well. Kind of a nice trade. So it functionally turns into just a negation on Warbler again. We are, Warbler is really the primary enabler, so a lot of these cards are just targeted at that card specifically. So a lot of the countermeasures still apply. For example, if you hard draw the Nerval, you can just normal summon it and proceed from there. But DD Crow also has the extra utility, perhaps like mid to late game, or if like they open pretty awkward hands, like if they open like Fractal plus Barrel Canary, you can just hit the Barrel Canary target, and it does have to summon both itself and the monster, so they don't get either summon, which is very, very strong. And of course, taking the name out of the graveyard as well. Countermeasures, of course. I mean, I haven't been mentioning Call by the Grave, but I feel like that's a pretty self-explanatory one just in terms of most of these hand traps. But yeah, again, it is pretty similar in effect to negating Warbler. But if you want to really play around DD Crow, you could just add with the Bird Call instead. Again, that plays harder into Droll like a lot, so you really do have to pick which card you are deciding to kind of lose to there. Next up is going to be Artifact Lancea, which is a card that I initially didn't think was very great against this deck, and admittedly it still isn't the best hand trap, but it does functionally perform the same as like Imperm on Kit, for example. So if you are a believer in that choke point, then you probably should be a believer in Lancea too, because it functionally does the same thing, except now, if you Imperm Kit, for example, and they have like a Karis keep going, they can still make reasonable plays ending on like DDO or Simorg or things like that. But if you have Lancea and you kind of just drop it before they get to Draco Future at any point, you do actually cut off 3 of their interruptions in best case hands, because they really can't access Oath as well as DDO or Simorg unless if they open very, very particularly. So in effect, if you can beat the Draco Future plus Robin board, again, very, very similarly to just negating Kit with Imperm, this is maybe a decent hand trap to look into. Like a lot of the other hand traps on this list, it does pair well with other cards, so that's something to consider as well. It also helps beat Small World and Prosperity, which is pretty relevant because Small World especially is getting a lot more popular. So if you want this as a kind of like a preventative measure to help dampen their consistency a bit more to what it would be without Small World, then that is something to definitely think about as well. And then Bird Heavy Hands really will just be the answer to Artifact Lancea, as long as you can just kind of get to that point. It's pretty much, again, if you get hit by any card that cuts off your tri-axis, you want to open, like, say, a pure Lyrilusc hand, right? So that's kind of basically the end goal at that point. Next up is going to be a card that actually isn't super popular right now, but is pretty interesting, and that's Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. So I kind of mentioned this with Gamma, but getting rid of the body on the field definitely is pretty impactful because it does stop things like, you know, Sapphire Swallow, and it also makes Utopia Draco Future a lot harder to actually utilize unless if you're willing to, you know, bring back like one of your recitals with Barrow Canary and then overlay that way. So this card actually is not bad to hit on the first recital Sterling. It's obviously not the most high impact because you know, they can actually choose what to search after the monster gets destroyed, so they can pivot pretty easily there. And also if they have like one other, you know, bird to begin with, like for example if they had like Warbird plus Cobalt Sparrow plus Nerval, then they could pivot pretty easily by just going like a normal summon Nerval, and then you'd have two searches at that point. So you typically be searching stuff like Sapphire Swallow plus Wagtail, so you can like go normal Nerval and then summon out Sapphire Swallow this way. Again, though, forcing them to commit to the normal summon is not that bad, so it is something to keep in mind. However, again, they can definitely still utilize things like Fairy Jet if they just are willing to commit to that normal summon, which is going to likely be the case. So you can normally end on, at minimum, Apex Avian plus Ensemble Robin. You can also, a lot of the times, actually end on your, your DDL as well. So this is definitely not the best hand trap, but it is something to kind of think about if you're just looking for more options. Another such similar card is Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. This card does hit a fair amount of things. A DD Crow would hit pretty much the same stuff, actually, being Turquoise Warbler and Barrow Canary. So it's decent for sure. I mentioned DD Crow first just because it is already kind of seeing play, especially in the mirror match, because if you want to search a supplementary tool to help beat the mirror, then that's pretty good. But if you're trying to, you know, pick more targeted cards for this matchup, I'm not entirely certain I would suggest these, but they still do certainly have utility. It is kind of, again, the same idea of Imperm and Veiler on the Warbler. So any countermeasures that apply to those cards apply to this as well. But yeah, hitting Turquoise Warbler or Barrow Canary are pretty much your main targets. You can also hit Ensemble Robin to add back, which is fine, but at that point, it's pretty late into the game. So its utility there is a lot more diminished, and you're really just denying one form of follow-up out of several. All right, so next up is going to be part 2, which is going to be the board breakers. That was it for the hand traps. So let's go ahead and get straight into this. So the first one is going to be obviously Droplet, Dark Ruler, you know, the cards that help clear the field, not clear the field, but just mass negate the field without actually having the opportunity to respond with monster effects. Of course, Oath is the mechanism to beat this, so you do have to open a good combination of these. Double Dark Ruler actually does work because it is not once per turn, funnily enough. So it actually has come up against me. So this is like a pretty decent one to like bulk up on. Obviously, if you open like Ruler and Droplet, it's good. Like Dark Ruler / Droplet plus any of the other cards here are also pretty decent. So yeah, I mean, not much to say here. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. You just, of course, have to find a way to actually break the board afterwards, with, for example, a Zeus being one of the most effective ways of doing so. But yeah, provided that these do resolve, you can play pretty freely. So if you are stocking up a lot on these DtheSecond tools, and by all means. However, I generally would not recommend them if you're only playing like maybe 6, because it is a lot harder to actually open up to. The percentages, I think, around 11%. I haven't looked at the math in quite a while, but yeah, that's definitely something to consider. Is that the likelihood of opening multiple of these, if you're playing a low quantity, is not as likely. So definitely be aware of Oath, of course. Lightning Storm Even Low Match is kind of similar, except it loses harder to the end board because they can just commit Apex Avian to negate these cards. So these are largely just pretty similar. I don't have a lot to explain here, so let's go ahead and move on. Tactics is another very similar card. One thing to note here is that it's a lot worse in terms of just trying to take the Ensemble Robin, because you usually can't since Barrow Canary is underneath it. But it is pretty interesting because if you are able to force both the Oath and the Apex Avian, you can use this to take the Draco Future, just to ensure that your combos go through. It's also nice if you can like just overlay Zeus on top of it, for example. So it's not horrible, but it definitely is weak in terms of the options that are available. Like between this and like Droplet, Dark Ruler, Lightning Storm evenly. I think this ranks lowest of those 5 cards. So yeah, this is a decent choice, but it's not one that I would actively side in. Like maybe if you have a game 1 and you're trying to break the board going second, then that's fair enough. But this is not a card that I would choose to play over other cards, especially. So next is going to be Mystic Mine. This is sort of a similar boat to Tactics, except if this does manage to stick, you're going to be in a pretty decent scenario if they have no outs to it, which realistically only applies game 1 because most, if not all, bird players are siding Order. So you can't really sit in this card. You have to be careful, especially past turn 1. And technically, if for some reason they didn't actually expend Oath, they could wait to use it. Like they could discard it for hand size limit and then use Oath to negate the mine. Now, to be fair, that's usually not how the scenario is going to play out because of the fact that using mine in tandem with other cards to get the Oath out of the graveyard to begin with. But again, it's a pretty decent pair with the above cards to help kind of just force this card through. Next up is going to be a card that actually isn't being talked about almost at all, but Alpha the Master Beast is actually very, very good if you are able to employ it, because it is not a once per turn to summon itself, so it does force at least 2 interruptions, because Robin is not super good against this card, since you can just keep bringing it back. So it trades a lot better than a card like Pankratops. So effectively, you would just go to the battle phase and like attack into probably the double Dragon Lords, so that if they activate double Dragon Lords to bounce it, you can, again, similar to Robin, just summon it right back. So it lines up pretty well, and then you can just go and activate the effect of main phase 2 to force another interruption, most likely going to be the Draco feature. Now, you probably do have to out it if they do take it, but I do think that this is a pretty interesting option to actually clear a fair amount of the interruptions, or at least just nullify the effectiveness of a couple of them. So that is definitely a pretty solid one. It is something I actually have considered siding in this deck myself because it is a beast, so it does have synergy with the deck. So it is a pretty interesting tech for the mirror. It's probably not great into a lot of other matchups, if we're being honest here, but this is a card that is something that is worth considering moving forward if you want, again, just more options for going second. Next up is another card that's not very popular right now, but could be decent later. Super Poly can help actually get rid of the DDL plus either the Apex Avian plus Robin to go into Muddragon of the Swamp, which is very, very good because that turns off Oath, and they can't obviously respond to Super Poly with Oath. So effectively, this actually outs the Robin too, because a lot of the times at the Oath setups, the Robin is only ending on 2 or 3 materials, so it's going to be 1700 attack maximum. So you can actually just deal with the Unstoppable Robin fairly easily at that point, and Muddragon can't be targeted, so that is quite good as well. Kind of helps beat in effect 3 of the interruptions, and then you reduce them just down to basically the Draco future at that point. So actually, if you count Oath, that actually takes care of 4 interruptions. So this card's actually not bad into this matchup if you are wanting to be super prepared for it. Maybe you're playing a deck like Grand Maju. So yeah, this could certainly be a card that you can employ into your deck. So that is just another thing to consider. If they try and play around this card, they can't really end on DDL, which turns off Oath anyways, so that makes it so other board breakers become more relevant. So this is a card that, like, if it does ever catch on and people do decide to play this card, then it could really just make the difference in terms of how the bird players end up crafting their boards. Next up is going to be Lava Golem in Sphere Mode. If you can play these cards, these are pretty decent for sure. It helps to shut off the Oath Engrave because you can just selectively pick whichever type. Most of the time it's just going to be DDL as the only Beast Warrior, so you contribute that a lot of the time, and that will be pretty good. You do, of course, have to capitalize on it while fighting through at least one other disruption, because on the board they're going to have generally 4. So even if you Sphere Mode 3 of them, you still have 1 more at least to kind of help deal with. But most of the time, I think that's manageable for a lot of decks, and even if you are playing like a trap deck, that can just set a bunch of back row. That helps like clear the board massively, and then you can just follow up with like a Torrential Tribute plus Strike Play or something like that. So pretty good. Next up is going to be part 3, which is going to be Floodgates, and I think these are fairly self-explanatory. If you're going first and can play Floodgates, they're going to be a big, big hindrance, so let's just go through them very quickly individually. So first one's going to be Artifact Scythe. This one is, in fact, a turn skip. There is nothing that the bird player can do within their engine to actually counteract this card. They have to draw non-engine cards to deal with it, so this card is pretty good. Skill Drain, same thing. They have nothing in their engine that can actually deal with this card, so once they draw like Twin Twister, a Cosmic, or things of that nature, there is not really anything they can actually do to, for example, like get monsters off board in response to an activation of their own effect on the field. You can think of things like Fairy Tale Snow back in the day to actually like quote-unquote dodge skill drain, but there are really no such effects here in this deck. The only thing I guess they could do is like they can still use Bureau Canary to go into like rank 1 plays, but even still, like their Zeus isn't going to do anything under skill drain anyways. So yeah, again, very, very powerful Floodgate. Summon Limit, just about as good as the other two, except they will get access to Omen eventually. So you do have to bear this one in mind. You are on a bit of a timer here, but if you are playing, maybe a bit of a faster deck, and like this is maybe a supplement to your end board, this can be one of the more effective floodgates for sure. Just because like they can't ever really go into Zeus to actually break your board. So yeah, Summon Limit is quite strong if you can implement it as well. Similarly, There Can Be Only One is pretty similar to Summon Limit, except certain tri-heavy hands can actually beat this card. If you open Fractal plus any Tri-Beast, you can actually just go into Omen pretty easily. That is, of course, if they shotgun this card and you know that it is there. But yeah, this card is again functionally quite similar to Summon Limit, but cutting off a lot of these starter plays with the birds is one of the best ways to tackle this deck, since the birds are the primary playmakers. Next up is going to be Gozen Match. This card is pretty decent. It does shut off Zeus access if they open a lot of birds, so it's harder to clear this card. And like they can still make a fair number of plays, but you have to watch out for Recital plus Assembled, because that is not at all being hindered by the Gozen Match. So if you have like a bunch of monsters on the field that they can pump with Recital, then you might be in a little bit of trouble. But that being said, yeah, starting out the Tri-Engine is very, very strong, because it makes it so that Omen can't really be an out since it is a dark monster. So that is something that is pretty noteworthy in comparison to the other two floodgates that I just mentioned, being Summon Limit and There Can Be Only One. Next up is going to be Rivalry. This card is a lot worse, admittedly. They can simply just do the normal Lyrilusc plays. And even though it does still cut off like Zeus, they can actually just pivot into the Omen, unlike Gozen. So this card is definitely worse in that manner. So this is not one that I would recommend, but it is an option, I suppose. But yeah, this is not one that is recommended. But yeah, the final one is going to be Dimensional Barrier, which is pretty good. It does just shut off like most of the extra deck. So they still have half of the cards to work with, notably the Tri-Engine, of course. So you are able to kind of still play through, if you are the bird player, with cards like Omen and deal with other threats on the field. It's not like the continuous floodgates where it will help actually deal with the floodgate itself via the Omen. So this being still effective is nice for that term, especially if you are playing a deck that is particularly vulnerable to Zeus. But yeah, this deck could still end on like Simorg plus DDL, through D barrier fairly reliably, if they open up well enough. So yeah, like Farid into Nerval, for example, to banish 2 to summon DDL after you summon like 2 birds is a very common way to end on Simorg plus DDL. It's like the same pathway if you get Drolled on like a Cobalt Sparrow, for example. So yeah, these are going to be all the cards that I had to mention in today's video. So thank you all so much for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, I will be considering a series where I cover specific matchups for this deck, and I will be kind of looking at both perspectives and trying to look at specific interactions. So if you want that video, definitely go ahead and like the video. If we get to 150 likes, I will be doing that, and you can go ahead and like kind of request certain matchups in the comments below. Also, if you do want to support me, please feel free to go ahead and check out the links in the description, as well as like and subscribe. And until next time, I will catch you in the next video. See you guys.